have over 4,000 newcomers. Multicultural, racial, ethnicity is real, and people just have different relationships too and comfort level when we start saying mental health and wellness. So the messenger becomes important. Sometimes it's helpful for the message to come from the system. Sometimes it's helpful for that message to come from faith-based organizations or community-based organizations. So there's a lot in this moment of urgency, I think being patiently impatient and really listening to what exactly is it that we're seeing that our students need. Finally, I think it's always a balance of the prevention and also where we need to intervene. There are definitely, and I know people will speak to it, I've had to deal with suicides in our district. There are the things that are at the crisis level, but there is also what I'm seeing is the importance of investing in one of the tenets of our strategic plan is joyful schools and getting intentional for each student, what brings them joy to the learning experience. Because when kids feel connected and there's that sense of purpose in their learning, again, connecting the academics and SEL, right, that helps to mitigate a kid who can get to the point where you've got the isolation. So all of that to just kind of illuminate the complexity of all of this, and I think at the very beginning, really the push now for us to really evolve and ask that question, like, what is the purpose of schooling post-pandemic and as we think about the world that we're living in?
And good afternoon, everyone. Good to see all of you as well. My name is Oliver Sicat, and I too have 3 kids, and I'm completely in over my head, even just this morning. But I also run a network of schools in Los Angeles and Orange County, and started a telehealth, mental health company for schools as well, too. And I do think that you can combine mental health, social, emotional learning, and academics together. At Ednovate, for the last 10 years, we've been developing what we call a whole child report card. And based on 3 tenets. 1, are you intellectually curious? 2, are you kind to yourself and others? 3, do you have your passion or purpose? Are you looking for your passion and purpose in life? Now, unfortunately, in 2021, in January, one of our students committed suicide and completely devastated us, 1. And then 2, also accelerated that the kind to self and others has to be more than just avoiding bad behavior. You have to grow a lot of other proactive skills there. And I think that when we started investing in that over the last 2 years, we found 2 different barriers to do this. And the barriers are, 1, the measures to get to that are so hard. It takes too much time. It's inefficient, and it's not designed in our schedule so already. And the second part is we aren't funded for those types of positions, so there's a lot of misalignment in the third-party supporters who are trying to help us in that work as well, too. So I think that while they're philosophically we're aligned, there's a lot of barriers that we're uncovering as we try to go down this path.
Thanks. Just to come back to you for a moment, Kyla, you're based in Oakland, in the San Francisco Bay Area, where housing affordability and economic challenges are out of control. So on top of thinking about student wellness and educator wellness, frankly, too, you're also contending with that. How is the district thinking about supporting students and staff in this time of economic uncertainty for students and staff?
That's such a great question, and coining the phrase "out of control," which it really is. The median price of a home in the Bay Area, I think, is about $900,000 right now. So it's a huge issue. I'm of the mindset that it's a problem when the folks who need to provide the public service in your community can't live there. So whether we're talking about teachers, nurses, firefighters, all the folks that we rely on to create safe and thriving communities cannot afford to be and live and be a part of that vibrant community. So it really is, like everything else, just the importance of bringing innovation. And so looking at anything, we're having conversations right now around transitional housing for unhoused youth. We're looking at trying to I'm on a collective impact table in my city where we're specifically looking at a particular part of our city and how to reverse African American displacement, because we're seeing that impact enrollment, we're seeing that impact having folks of color in our city. So it's really a conversation where we're having to bring community, we're having to bring the public sector, we're having to bring the private sector to really take a step back and think creatively around funding and think creatively around solutions. I would say the other thing that I'm seeing in terms of our educators in schools is that everyone has had a taste of flexibility besides folks who've worked in schools. And they also want to have a taste of that flexibility as well, which then means we need to think innovatively around staffing models. I'm really nervous about the idea, even if you only have 11 kids in a class, when you think about how disparate a lot of the challenges are. Some kids did accelerate during the pandemic, and they're a fourth grader ready to do what we would consider in our old model 8th grade stuff, right? Maybe it's the mental health piece where they need a lot more intervention. And so the overwhelm for one person, no matter how talented they are, to hold all of that is actually also causing talented people to leave the field because there's just so much overwhelm. I can't possibly meet, right, the challenges of the moment. And so really thinking about how we have different staffing models that could perhaps give more flexibility in the classroom so that people feel like the work can be sustainable, I think is another, just question that we need to grapple with. I think everyone to some degree wants to be able to hold on to some level of being able to have a bit more, whatever well-balanced means. And folks in schools want a taste of that as well. And so how do we do that and still serve students, I think is a question that we need to wrestle with.
Could I just add, as we talk about this whole approach, and you mentioned housing, fundamentally education is a system that I like to call it the motherboard because everything else kind of chimes into it. And we can't talk about coming together in the name of well-being if we're not looking at it systemically. You mentioned housing, there's a health component, there's so many pieces, and when we think about well-being, we like to talk about a systemic approach to social emotional learning because we realize, especially right now, the entire village that takes care of children are stressed. Kids are stressed, educators are stressed, parents are stressed, stress amongst the community. And if we're not talking about what are those holistic supports, whether it's looking at school discipline, whether it's supporting parents, then we're going to miss the mark because SEL or well-being is not something that just happens within the classroom. You have to think about the school building. You have to think about the community in which that school building is nestled or housed in. And there's another component that I don't think we're talking about enough, which is actually one of the focuses for us this year, is adult SEL, and how important it is to have adults who can not only model these skills and competencies that we're talking about, but also believe in them and have them themselves. Because if we think about it, some of our most poorly behaved people are adults. And our kids are, and politicians, I would beg to say. But I digress. See, we need to be thinking about the important role that adults and all adults who touch kids' lives, whether it is the bus driver, the crossing guard, the office manager, the nurse, all of these adults are modeling the behaviors that our kids will ultimately look after. So as we talk about coming together in the name of well-being, we have to recognize that this is across systems, but we also have to be talking about adults and their wellness and their ability to model and support our kids as well.
Jared, can I jump?
Absolutely.
So we think a lot about a systems approach. So Rebecca with the JED Foundation, and we're a suicide prevention and mental health organization that works at the systems level. So this really resonates. We are really aware of the tension between the need to think about how systems interact to support youth mental health, reduce suicide, improve outcomes, and the desperate need for a now solution that's real, and the landscape is full of promises, and there's typically not a lot of attention paid towards measurement. Do we know what we need? How do we know it's working? How can we tell it's going to work later? So our work sits on top to provide ability to assess and sort of measure that, but it is exactly to the point of more than one particular intervention. It's a complicated system. We're solving complex problems in the motherboard, and there's a risk of moving too quickly in a way because from a true reasonable place of wanting to provide support.
So building on these last two comments, I mean, it's clear that we're dealing with like a multidimensional, multi-level of the systems issue, and because you mentioned the politicians, it's also in this political context, and in talking about well-being and academics or social and emotional learning, social, emotional, and academic development can be a lightning rod. So Stephen, I'd love to hear from you, like how do you navigate that? How should we be thinking about navigating that challenge?
Yeah, clearly there's not an easy answer to that, but in terms of our work, and my name's Steve Smith, I co-founded a company called Intellispark. We work with about 400 schools around the country right now on student well-being issues. And I think you have to start from a place where all parents care about the well-being of their kids. And we have to start from a conversation, and I really resonate with some of what's been said here, that we can adultify problems, we can also jargonify, if that's a word, problems, which it will be today. And when you have this conversation with parents, if you can get to the points of agreement, instead of getting stuck on language that may cause disagreement or lack of understanding, I think we can move so much farther, so much faster. Just because we don't agree on everything doesn't mean we can't do anything together. And so when I think about the work that we're doing in districts in California and in districts in Oklahoma, districts in West Virginia, and districts in New York, it's because we've been able to get out of those corners and think about what's really good for kids. And what are the skills that we want our kids to take with them from one grade to the next, from one building to the next, and out into the next phase of life. And if we can just engage everybody in that conversation from a place where we assume positive intent, we can make a lot more progress.
And Rebecca, do you want to share more about how the Jed Foundation is thinking about the connections between academics and perhaps in the context of navigating this challenge?
Yeah, sure. So we really look to a landscape of intervention. So we have a systems-based approach that was sort of developed in the Air Force. So we're looking at boundaried communities and understanding that there are levers to pull in boundaried communities, schools similarly situated to military in that respect. And when one is able to make changes at the system level, then you see reduction in suicide and improvement in mental health. And the takeaway is one of those areas, and there's 7 areas, one is access to clinical care. It's very important to think about access to clinical care, but it's not every single one of them. So there are 6 other areas: life skills, social emotional learning, life skills, depending on where you are and what you call life skills. Feelings of social connectedness is one of the most protective factors for suicide prevention. So, the ability to feel connected to the basketball team, the ability to feel that you have a caring adult that is going to check on you, wildly protective. So what does that look like in a system? And then how do we measure that through proxy metrics? The N for suicide is low, thank goodness, right? So we're not measuring suicide rate, but what are the proxy metrics that we can look to understand if we're making systems change that we're then, through the logic model, able to have individual level impact? And so we need to take an entire systems approach, and essentially all boats rise. So whether we're looking at academic, we're looking at social emotional, we're looking at wellness, these broad interventions don't just target any one of those because they are so deeply interconnected. And the ultimate task is to enable systems to think critically about intervention moving forward so that we're not essentially taking all the tools in the toolbox and kind of just dumping it on the problem, but almost every single tool will be appropriate in the right circumstance, and that's really the method.
Can I chime in on this politics piece?
Sure.
Because we're squarely in it. And actually, I've been called things that I didn't even know what they were until I started doing this work. So I was like, okay, this is how we're dealing with this. You know, as we think about the political and the national discourse, I think it's very important to note that right now what we are seeing is a tale of two stories. You see what politicians are saying, or a very small group about, oh, SEL or mental wellness doesn't have a place in school, we should be only focused on academics. There's this story of there's not the role, that shouldn't be a teacher's job, it should just be in the home. Meanwhile, what we're seeing on the other side of the story is our kids are telling us what they need. We're seeing the CDC report that just came out on girls. We're seeing the data. We have chronic absenteeism rates that are higher than pre-pandemic and even in the midst of the pandemic now. So when we start talking about what the data is saying and what our kids are telling us, it's very clear. And so as our organization continues to think about how do we continue to do the work that's best for kids and that we know is right for kids and our educators, one, we have to stick to the data. Overwhelmingly, over 80% of parents support social emotional learning or wellness in their schools. When you talk about social emotional learning or wellness as a retention strategy for educators, we see an increase of educators who are staying in the classroom if they feel connected, not only to their students, to their families, to the building leaders. So that connectedness and this work that we're talking about is not only beneficial for academics, for kids, but teacher retention, and we are hemorrhaging educators. So when we talk about wellness, we have to bring up these data points. Not that we can convince everybody, but the data should be speaking for itself. The second thing is we are amongst a room of leaders. We fundamentally have an obligation to be leaders right now. We cannot continue to watch the headlines, watch the news, and just shake our head and say, oh, this is crazy. Because it is crazy, but it's happening right now, and it's impacting the practice and the outcomes of kids in the classroom. So we as adults can't just sit back, and now is not the time for scared leadership in education. Trust me, there are a lot easier jobs that I could be doing than this. That would also allow me to stay home more with my own kids. But the reality of it is we need leaders who are willing to stand up and say, no, I'll take the hit, but I'm gonna speak on behalf of what's right for kids and educators. And history is being made right now, and we each decide. So if I could take privilege, just challenge each of you to do one thing, is to think about the needs of the communities that you serve and how you can lend your voice, because we need voices who are saying our kids are struggling, our educators are struggling, we need these supports. It's the only way we're gonna push back on the politics, and we can't be scared. The Twitter trolls are real, they are, but they're keyboard warriors. We're foot soldiers. We're gonna fight a different fight.
Just to add to that, I would say one, I think place matters, and I think being that we are in one of the most tense political eras of our time around equity, around wellness, that part of the job of being a leader is to understand the love language of your community, right? Because it's about putting it on the table, but it's also about how do you get to solutions to transform students and families. So I'm in the Bay Area, right? I'm in Oakland. We are Activist Central, Black Panther. I can put it all on the table, honey, because that is part of the culture where I am. But if I'm trying to do the same work 40 minutes away from Oakland, I may have to wrap that differently, right? And that's part of the capacity building of system leaders right now. You're having folks that are getting into the jobs, trying to do the good work. They're there 2 hours, 1 month, and because it's framed in the wrong way, right, they gotta go, right? The politics are too hot. That is a problem we have to fix. We have to continue to build the capacity of leaders to be strategic in this work, to get to the transformation. If you aren't in the seat long enough, right, you can't do the work. That's one. Two, to the point about systems and the piece around being patient, impatient, but patience in terms of the systems change. It is too much for a school system to do this work unilaterally. That is one of the reasons folks are leaving, right? When you're talking about mental health, you got to look at the community. We're seeing across all communities violence. In the last 3 months, I've had guns on about 3 to 4 campuses. Anytime you have an incident like that, that's trauma for the students, that's trauma for the parents, That's trauma for the principals. That's trauma for the staff. So every day I got to start the next day calling the principal, just how are you? Sometimes it's silence, there's tears, they're scared, right? And so there's all of these kind of supports and conversations and capacity building to hold your schools through that. And the school is not set up to do all of that themselves. So that means as a superintendent, I've got to develop strategic relationships, and relationships take time. They manifest at the speed of trust with my mayor, right? To be very cognizant. What are my expectations about what your agenda is, about making sure that my schools are safe, right? We can talk about, reimagining safety, that's great, but if I have a gun, if I have a sexual assault, what is a crisis response that I expect from you? How do I expect the police on my schools, when they come to my schools, to show up? I'm not putting that on. I can't put that on my principals, but then I shouldn't be surprised if my principals turn over every year to 2 years. So it's reimagining also, not just relationships at the school site, but across systems, right? Who is going to hold, yes, educators should know the signs of suicide, but they're not health clinicians, right? How are we working within your system? Who's responsible for the counseling, right? How are you building those relationships with the healthcare system? How are you building those relationships with the youth development agencies in your community? And figuring out, how do we work together? How are we reimagining that village sensibility? And then technology comes in. We're piloting with Salesforce, right, for our cost system. So if you're having a conversation with a student and then you're having a conversation with a student, we use technology to document what we're learning about individual students to make better choices on recommendations to families, to make better choices on the types of support that we're getting. But that really is the 21st century kind of push, is it's got to be a multi-system response to actually get to the level of need that we're seeing and to make the work sustainable so that people actually feel, right, that they're making a difference in the lives of our students and families, and thus want to stay in the work. It takes 3 to 5 years to actually do systems change. I know everyone in this room knows that. So when you start looking at the attrition in the classroom level, at the school building level, at the superintendent level, we are not going to do what we need to do for students if we don't get serious about this level of sustainability.
Thank you. Kyla, thank you for taking us to this point about your partnership with Salesforce and using it to identify data points. I'm curious to hear from Oliver and Stephen, just based on your experience with well-being-oriented educational technology. The data seems like it might not be enough, and sometimes a lot of companies aren't always thinking about the implementation supports that have to accompany the great products that are built. So what can you all share with the audience about what that looks like in your respective contexts?
Yeah, so happy to jump in on that first. I think the first thing is we've heard already on this panel, and you don't have to go far outside this room to hear a lot about the sense of overwhelmedness that people have in their work today. And so I think the first thing that's incumbent on those of us who work in the education technology sector is to recognize where our members and clients are and where their teachers and staff are, and to design systems that meet them where they are. And so I think for us, the conversation about data is really interesting. Like, people do need to know important bits of information, but you can get so overwhelmed by the amount of information that you're looking at that it becomes hard to get out of this, decision paralysis around what do we do next. And so I think the kind of next generation, as we think about technology and the challenge there, is to move beyond looking at data and to move into doing something through that platform that was harder to do without. And so what I mean by that is, what are all those points of friction in getting actual work done in the building today that we can eliminate or at least streamline so that educators know where to go when they need to get assistance? They don't have to go through a 6-point checklist to figure out how they get help. They can simply ask for help, and the system can help them get to the right place. Or you can easily capture information in the course of delivering information, as opposed to making a separate step of logging every interaction that we have with a family recognizing that there's just it's hard enough to find the time to do the communication in the first place. To have to log the communication later means that you're not going to get the benefit of knowing what's been happening. And so I think, there are lots of ways. One of the things that we did early on, just informed by some of the schools that we were working with, is recognize that the best way to reach teachers with information about what was going on with their kids and share that information was to summarize in a personalized email for them weekly information about what was going on with their class and their students that captured information from all their other classes. And so it was just in a 3-minute view, a teacher could go someplace they were already going to check their email and get new and interesting insights about what was happening with their kids in the building. Some positive, maybe some challenges, but have a clearer picture of what happens outside the 45 minutes that they're working with that student in the course of a day. But if we had asked teachers to log into a different system to check for that information, that was a level of friction that just wouldn't have been overcome.
Yeah, just to add on that, on the school side, what we do is that I think it's really important that schools have a measure of SEL that students and parents and staff members reflect on constantly just as much as they do with grades. And we put that in our whole child report card, and our kids have access to that. But then it begs the question is, what can I do if I'm not meeting my criteria there? And so on the ed tech side, OpenSeat, which we created, we found some fascinating things about implementation that I would never expected. First, it's a telehealth company, diverse care providers one-on-one for students who need it when they need it the most. We thought that students on their own will go and scan and make appointments night times, daytimes, over the weekends. Didn't happen. We put all the signs up there, but students didn't understand exactly what does well-being coaching look like. What is it? How is it important to me? The advisors had no idea, or the teachers had no idea how to use it as well, and it enlightened it to us that this is a new product in the school system. This is nothing that normal everyday teachers are used to every time. So there's a whole education curve. So now what we're doing is that when we partner with schools, we only look for schools that are willing to go slow to go fast. People who are willing to have space dedicated for students so that they can go to it at school because they feel that's the most trusting place. That there's a point person that will make the phone calls, will get the kid out of school to be in there. And it's not scalable fast, but it's the right thing, I think, for us to do to get the students the supports that they need. And I think we're going to see how long that will take to go faster, but we're learning that on the back end.
Great. Thank you. One more question before we go to our wrap-up questions. So I'm just planting the seed for you all to start thinking about your responses. I guess one thing that I've heard is that schools can't do this on their own, and they need partnerships from several different levels. So Rebecca, I'm curious, like how do you all think about partnerships and helping schools to navigate the partnerships they need to be able to create the web of support that students need to thrive?
That's a great question. So we spend a lot of time thinking about partnership types. So there are different levels of intervention and different kinds. So everything from what is a community provider and what is that relationship and where's the handoff. It is best practice, not always possible, to have a feedback loop. So to be able to have a partnership that provides there's bi-directional information ultimately, so that the child is at the center and we're able to provide services and that there's feedback too. Not always entirely possible, but it's something that we look for. We also think about local application. So it is very, very different to stand up an intervention depending on where you are. And the resources that are available and the relationships, the trust building is real, and it takes quite a significant amount of time, but allows for trusted partnership, trusted intervention, not having to navigate who's coming into our school situation. It is, and it can't be the responsibility of the superintendent alone. There needs to be a team of folk that hold the responsibility not just for the partnership, but the development of that relationship. So what does it mean to cultivate a relationship, and how can we distribute those relationships so that it's held in a trusted place, but not the sole responsibility of a single person in any situation? So those tend to be the factors that we look at.
Great. Thank you so much. So one thing we are really good at education is chasing the next bright, shiny object. And so we've heard how critical this is for the right now, but I guess I'm curious to hear from each of you, is this a fad? Is well-being, a focus on well-being here to stay? Or what do we need to do collectively to make it stick around?
I think that question really goes to, so what is the purpose of schooling as we think about the next 10, 20, right, 30 years? I was thinking you were raising your hand, and then I was just realizing you were like, you have 5 more minutes, wrap it up. Okay, thank you. So in our system, which is a hard conversation, I'm pushing pretty hard, we need to fundamentally redesign schools, right? Because even all of these things, our natural inclination is the teacher. The teacher is not Beyonce and the president all wrapped in one, right? You know? So we've got to, I had the ability to take a sabbatical. I went to Dublin, Ireland, and I just happened to be there when they had this whole mental health week. And they were actually featuring some of the work from CASEL there. Everybody across the world is dealing with the same issues. So there were students there, parents, they have chaplains in their schools, and I was listening to the dialogue, and I leaned over to the teachers. I was like, wow, you guys have so many resources. Like, how are you making this work? And they looked to the left and the right. They were like, we have no idea. We're still trying to figure out how to put all these pieces together. So I think this need to like really reimagine if mental health is going to be a center of a child being highly educated, knowing who you are, right? Knowing how to deal with grief, how to deal with loss, how to deal with failure. That for kids who actually came out stronger from the pandemic, there were things that they learned about themselves, how to regulate themselves. If we're saying now, actually that's a fundamental part of learning, just like reading, what does that mean for the staffing model in schools? Are we just saying, oh, we're just gonna pile on a whole other level of classes in the credential program and the teacher is gonna do that too? Or do we have to think differently around, right, who is in the school? I think that's one. Two, for relationships, we've been doing community school work about 12 years now. Thankfully, we've been able to have the same partner in Kaiser Permanente. They have funded us that entire time, right? We've developed MOUs. We now have community school managers at about 3/4 of the school, and it's still nowhere near where it needs to be. And some of the things we're learning is then there's the organizational mind shift when you talk about having the school district work with the community, right? And I feel like there are things I'm still learning as a superintendent how to do that. How are you developing your principals to be able to bring in community? So there's a whole transformation and shift in terms of how we're thinking about school, right? Let's not even bring in artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, like to say, what really is your English class if you can speak a command and they can crank out an essay? So it is a moment now for us to step back and get clear around what does it mean to be highly educated, right? And to do it in a way where this actually becomes the center of learning. And I think we're just scratching the surface. That's the purpose of these conversations now.
If I could just chime in on a couple things.
quick
Janice
hits.
Jackson, yes, Janice Jackson, who's our board member and a brilliant educator, actually earlier today said at the luncheon, this is hopefully the disruption that we needed to lay the infrastructure for the future. So hopefully the pieces that we're putting into place right now, wellness will not be a fad. I also think it's important to name CASEL is the organization that coined this phrase almost 30 years ago. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary next year. So this is not something that is a fad or a silver bullet. It has been around a long time. Wellness, connectedness, relationship is paramount to humanity. So as long as we have humans, all learning is social and emotional. So this is not going to go away.
Yeah, and I'm just hoping it's not a fad, but until I see policies in place that fund mental wellness at a federal level and reimburse schools, if we see states doing the same thing, if we see schools fund staffing formulas change, then I will believe that it's not a fad. But I think that those are structures that will reinforce it to be a fad.
Yeah, and clearly not a fad. My mom is an 80-year-old woman who taught first grade for 30-something years of her career. What I told her what we were doing, she was like, that's just good teaching. I was like, got it, Mom.
Well, and students are telling us what they need, right? So the shift has been that we've given them language, right? So there's language and voice in a way that there hasn't been before. So now we need to listen to it and respond. But I think that has been the watershed that has come out of this.
Wonderful. So the first time in my life I have not run over. So please give the panel a round of applause.